welcome back to another video where I'm setting up my reading journal. This time I'm setting up all the spreads for July and August. And I had quite a range of reads over the summer, so I'm excited to give you a little bit of a wrap up and share my thoughts on all the books I read and just spend some time reminiscing over the summer. As I've mentioned a couple times in a variety of places, this summer was quite hectic in my family, and I've been exceedingly busy in my personal life, so it's kind of pushed everything back, delayed a bunch of things, and I'm working hard to catch up. So if some videos are coming out later than usual, please bear with me while I get back on track. But as per usual, I'm starting with the cover page, and I really wanted to do something exceedingly summery and warm feeling for July. So I picked out images that really gave me that feeling of a really warm, sunny, cozy day, including this really beautiful flower pattern. I normally don't add patterned background paper to my spreads. I normally stick to tea-stained paper or brown wrapping paper or something along those lines. But when I saw this pattern, I immediately knew it would make such a beautiful addition to a scrapbooky, layered, summery spread. And I just love how it looks so much that I might need to start incorporating patterned papers a little more often. I'm also adding in a moth and some flowers and some washi tapes to really add to that layered look, and sticking with a pretty consistent color palette of browns and beiges, both leaning more towards a yellowy tone and a pink tone, and little hints of green and orange and yellow. I'm using my stamps to add the header and some other decorations. As per usual, I'll link as many of the supplies I'm using as I can in the description box for you. But I really like how this cover page turned out. It felt very, very summery to me, which was exactly what I was going for. And now it's time to flip over to my summary spread with all the books I finished in July and my reading stats for the month. So in July, I managed to finish 7 books: There, Red Side Story, A Prayer for the Crown Shy, A Power Unknown, The Fifth Wave, Pride and Prejudice, and Pew. This was a pretty nice mix of genres as well. It's contemporary fiction, comedic science fiction, queer romantasy, YA sci-fi, a classic, and literary fiction. So a nice mix, a nice smorgasbord of genres in July. And I had a mix of ratings as well. My lowest rating in July was 3 stars, so not bad. I didn't have any books I absolutely hated or regretted reading. And I did have a couple 5-star reads, which is always the goal, always what I'm most excited for. Prepped all my stats in Canva as per usual. I'll link the video where I go through in detail how I create my stats in Canva, and also how I find and size my book covers and other assets I use in my reading journal, so you can check that out if you missed it. I definitely feel as though this year I have been a lot less focused on my reading stats than usual, and I've kind of admitted defeat at this point. I think I'm just gonna go with the flow and let it be what it is, because like I mentioned, this has been quite a hectic summer in my personal life, but really it's been just a hectic year all around. Lots of grief and lots of joy and lots of change. And it's been a little overwhelming, and I've found a lot of solace and comfort in the books I've read. I found some escape in the books I've read in harder months. I've found adventure and joy, and it's been lovely, but I've definitely been mood reading significantly more this year than the past several years. And really just a lot less focused on my goals or meeting specific standards with my stats. And again, I think it's just been, I've been so overwhelmed that I'm just happy I'm still reading, to be honest. And I think I'm gonna be easier on myself this year than I normally would be. And next year I can kind of refocus in on my goals and on being more aware of my stats and being more intentional of the books I'm picking up. It is something I still value, but it's also okay, I think, or at least I'm telling myself it's okay, that when life gets hard and stressful and busy and chaotic and overwhelming, sometimes it's okay to relax your standards, or at least it feels like it has to be okay for me to do that. Something has to give. And this year, that's some of the more thoughtful, planned out, intentional reading. And I think I'm okay with that. So I'm still tracking my stats. I still am interested in seeing where my reading is going. And it'll be a nice comparison at the end of the year to see how this year looks next to previous years where I was a little bit more aware of my stats as the year went on and a little more intentional about it. And it kind of gives me a good control for what a year looks like when I'm pretty much solely mood reading as a place to start from to set some goals next year. Once I had my summary page done and my stats all glued in and labeled, it was time to start on my individual book entry pages. So starting with There by Tommy Orange, this was our book club pick in July. And I didn't know much about this book going into it. We had chosen to read from an Indigenous author in July, and this was the book that won our poll. And I had heard of this book in passing. I'd added it to my TBR, but I didn't know a lot about it. And as soon as I started it, I couldn't put it down. I was so engaged. I was so immersed immediately. The characters just took hold of me and wouldn't let go. I was emotionally invested essentially immediately, and as it continued, I just got more and more invested and more stressed about where it was going. And when it got where it was going, it was just as devastating as I'd worried it would be. It's a fantastic book. I think it was really well written. It's very well paced. It has a lot of different characters and a lot of points of view, but I found it actually wasn't too hard to stay on top of everything, to remember who everyone was and how they were connected and related to each other. There were, of course, some characters that I connected to more than others or cared about more than others, but overall, I think this was so fantastically done. Every character was interesting and intriguing in their own way, and it was just so gorgeous and delivered its message in a very powerful way that I can see staying with me for a very long time. I would highly, highly recommend it, and I gave it 5 stars. I enjoyed specifically taking a look at what it is to be an urban Indian, as they say in the book, to be part of an Indigenous community within a city. And the merging of identities that exists there was a really interesting concept to zero in on. Next up, we have Red Side Story by Jasper Fforde. This is a sequel, and I read the first book last year in this series and just loved it. It was so funny and unexpected. It's a sci-fi dystopia in the vein of Brave New World and 1984 and all our favorite sci-fi dystopias, but it has a much more comedic spin, almost similar to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sort of style. And I was very pleasantly surprised by the first book in the series, and then even more pleasantly surprised to learn that the sequel was coming out very soon, because the first book I think came out a decade ago or something like that. So I was very excited to read this, and while I still enjoyed it a lot, it was not quite as fantastic as the first book. It's possible that I overhyped myself. Definitely possible, but it didn't hit me quite the same way as the first book. In some ways, I felt it was both too vague and explained too much in the ending. It left me wanting more, but I still found the characters really fun. I still thought the world was really interesting, and I did like the answers we got, even if I felt like we almost learned too much about the world while still not getting answers to the questions I was most curious about. Still a fantastic book. Would highly recommend both books in this duology. I think it's just going to be a duology. Very worth your time if you enjoy sci-fi, if you enjoy new dystopian worlds, and also if you enjoy comedy in your sci-fi dystopias. Next up, I read Pew by Catherine Lacey. This one I saw recommended on Reddit, and the comment recommending it, I can't remember what it was. I didn't save it, unfortunately, but it was so intriguing to me that I immediately sought out this book and started reading it. And I'm glad I did, because while this was not a perfect book, it's not a favorite of all time, I thought it was really, really great. It's very strange, very up my alley in the experimental, eerie, odd fiction realm, which y'all know I love. And it's exploring quite a bit thematically and does it in a very interesting way. It feels almost like a Stepford Wives, too perfect town full of eerie, unsettling, sort of uncanny valley vibes. And our protagonist is sort of dropped into this environment and feels very much like a fish out of water and is trying to get their bearings while this community tries very hard to define and categorize our protagonist in a way that they simply can't be defined and categorized. And we learn more and more things that start to feel more and more alarming and dangerous, and things unravel. I don't want to say too much and spoil things, but I just thought this was really well done. It made me very curious to read more of this author's work. And just generally, this book really made me think. I highlighted probably 75% of the book as I was reading because there were so many quotes that struck me. It was just a very interesting book, so I'd highly recommend it if you are a fan of weird lit. I think you'd like this one. Flipping over to my final spread for July and starting with Pride and Prejudice. I read this for a reading vlog, so I'm not going to say very much about it. I'll link that reading vlog down below so you can watch it and hear many of my thoughts without and with spoilers on this book. But I really enjoyed it. It was a reread, but I had forgotten basically everything about it because I read it so young the first time, and I was really glad to reread it. I had a great time. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I gave it 4 stars. Then we have The Fifth Wave. This is the first book in a YA sci-fi trilogy. I think I also saw this one recommended on Reddit, and it was okay. I ended up reading the whole trilogy, as you'll see. I read the other 2 books in August very quickly, and the reason for that was not that they were so fantastic or so engaging that I just had to know what happened next. It was more so that they were very, very easy reading, and I was listening to the audiobooks as a way to fall asleep at night. So I went through the whole trilogy very fast, but it's not a favorite by any means. It was okay. There were some interesting ideas here and there, but it did feel very young, and it had a lot of the tropes of YA speculative fiction that get on my nerves, and the characters were quite irritating in general. I'm not sure I liked any of them, so I'm not sure I would really recommend this series. It's not for me, and I acknowledge that these books are not written for me. I am not the target demographic, but they did serve their purpose of books I could listen to for 20 minutes before I fell asleep at night very well. And they were very easy listening while I did chores and did things around the house. If you want some easy listening sci-fi to do with an alien invasion, have at it, see what you think. I will say the first book to me was the strongest of the series, so if you're not a big fan of the first book, I wouldn't recommend continuing, but who knows? We all have different tastes, so it could be a new favorite for you. Speaking of everyone having different taste, next up is A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, and it kind of breaks my heart that this little duology did not work for me as well as Becky Chambers' previous work, because I have loved everything else I've read by this author, but for For whatever reason, this little duology didn't quite land for me. I did like the first book better than this one, but they both kind of had the same problems for me, which was largely just that they felt very empty to me. It felt like there was a disconnect somewhere. I really struggled to connect to or care about the characters. There wasn't much going on plot-wise. I didn't feel like the themes were being explored really at all. They were just kind of dropped in occasionally or mentioned here and there, but it just felt like there wasn't much going on in these books, and I didn't feel particularly connected to them, nor did I feel like I got much out of reading them. So that's just my personal take. I know a lot of people loved this duology, and I wish I could have loved it because I love Becky Chambers' other work, but this one wasn't for me, and I'm just hoping that Chambers' next series will be right up my alley again, because I want to keep reading and loving their work. The last book I read in July was A Power Unbound. This is book 3 in a queer romantasy series. I really enjoyed the series. I thought each of the 3 books was fantastic. These might be some of my favorite romantasy I've ever read, but this final book in the trilogy specifically was my absolute favorite of the whole series. I loved it so much. I loved the writing. I loved the couple. I especially loved that the other couples from the previous books were very present in this one, so we got to kind of see the larger dynamic between all these characters and got to kind of resolve their storylines a little bit more. But specifically the couple in this book, I loved. It felt very realistic. They had their own trauma and struggles and issues with being open and vulnerable with each other that they worked to overcome, and they had so much chemistry together. There was so much intimacy emotionally as well as physically. All 3 of the pairings have a combination of being very romantic but also being very spicy, but in this book it just felt like it hit the peak, especially for the romantic emotional intimacy side. I fell in love with these characters and just wanted the best for them and really enjoyed following their journey. And I just thought the writing reached a new level. There were so many gorgeous quotes that I couldn't help but write down and save. Just gorgeous, beautiful. If you're a fan of romantasy, or you're trying to become a fan of romantasy, especially if you've struggled to find sort of your niche within romantasy, I would highly recommend trying this series. There is just something really special and unique here that I have not seen in a lot of the other romantasy I've read, and I just think it's really worth your time. Moving on to August, for my cover page, I wanted it to still feel warm and summery, but a little bit moodier, and I really like this cover page image. Something about it feels very end of summer, fall is around the corner, things are getting a little chillier and crisper and cooler, but summer is holding on just a little bit. Moving on to my summary spread, I finished 11 books in August, and those were Pluralities, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, The Weak Spot, Don't Want You Like a Best Friend, You're the Problem, It's You, The Infinite, The Last Star, Participation, A Torch Against the Night, Bodies to Die For, and Camp Lanier. And this is, again, sort of a mix. We have some experimental, weird fiction, we have historical fiction, we have historical romance, we have YA sci-fi and YA fantasy, as well as some horror, both adult and YA horror. So really, again, pretty wide-ranging genres here. And again, a mix of ratings. I unfortunately had more books that I didn't enjoy this month. I had 3 2-star reads and quite a few 3 stars that were very middle of the road. But I did have 1 5-star read, so not all is lost. And that was The Weak Spot. I read that in my Weird Books reading vlog, so I'll link that down below for you so you can check that out. 2 of the 5 books I read in that video I finished in August, and then the other 3 were in September, but you can check that out to hear all my extensive, in detail thoughts. Moving into my individual book entries, starting with our book club pick for August, which was The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. This one started slow for me. I wasn't quite sure where we were going, and it took me a little bit of time to get invested. But by the end, I was fully on board and very emotionally invested and very emotional in general. I think this book did a lot of things very well in exploring the experience of an immigrant community, especially the experiences of Black Americans and Jewish Americans in and around the 1930s. And the thing that it did the best in my mind, or the thing that really stuck with me the most, was the way it explored the treatment of disabled and mentally ill people in this time period. It was devastating and heartbreaking and unfortunately very real, and the way it all came together in the end felt just perfect. So I would highly recommend this book. Definitely give it some time. For me, it was quite a slow start, but after that, it really picks up the pace. And if you're going to get invested, I think you'll be invested by around a third of the way in. I've seen from ratings that this one didn't work for everyone, but I think the people it did work for, it made quite a big impact on. Then I read the last 2 books in the Fifth Wave series. As I mentioned, for me, the first book was by far the best. Book 2 and 3 continued on with the same issues I had in the first book, but started adding more and more issues. I'm not going to get into detail. Honestly, I don't think it's worth my time or yours for me to talk extensively about this series. Like I said, I read it mostly because it was very easy listening and helped me fall asleep. Book 1 and 2 were fine. Book 3 to me was a letdown. And finally on the spread, we have Pluralities by Ari Silver. This was an Nick Alley arc. I was very confused when this book started, and by the end, I was loving it, but I was still confused. In some ways, I wish this book had been split into 2 because there were 2 very interesting concepts happening and they were very distinct. And I could see some connections here and there, but the connections weren't made as blatantly or as extensively as I would have liked. And I was interested in both and felt like I didn't get quite as much as I wanted from either because they were both existing in the same book. In this case, I would have loved for them to be separated and to have one book that was one of the 2 settings and one book that was the other, that really allowed us to fully absorb them, or that this book was just longer so that there was more time to really tie them together, because I felt like I was always missing something and there was something just out of reach, just out of my grasp of understanding with how these were connecting. And while I liked the more sci-fi setting and found it intriguing, I was definitely far more emotionally invested in the more contemporary setting, though it still had a bit of a sci-fi uncanny quality to it. The characters in the more modern contemporary setting were much more vivid to me, and I was a lot more invested in the journey of the main character there, who was exploring their own gender identity and their sexuality, and I found it quite wholesome and heartwarming and moving, but I just felt a little bit pulled in too many directions because of the way this was structured. I would definitely still recommend it though, especially if you're a fan of a little bit more experimental sci-fi, especially sci-fi that is exploring queer identity. Moving on to some more book entries here. I have a little historical romance duology, Don't Want You Like a Best Friend and You're the Problem, It's You. I had the second one as an influencer copy audiobook from Libro FM. If you haven't tried Libro FM and you like audiobooks, I would highly recommend them. When you get audiobooks through Libro FM, you're supporting a local bookstore that you can choose. So I'm supporting a bookstore in Edmonton with all of my audiobook purchases through the app, and I just think that's a really fantastic idea, a really great way to support smaller local bookstores, even when you're purchasing your audiobooks through an app conveniently on your phone. Very cool. But because I had the second book as an influencer copy, I wanted to read the first one first, just in case I needed it for context. And I ended up enjoying the first one more than the second one. This is, while it's not fantasy, it's kind of similar to A Power Unbound, where each book focuses on a different couple, and all the couples are queer, and they're all interconnected, and they exist in each other's books, but each one focuses on a different couple specifically. So the first book is a sapphic pairing, and I just loved this book. I thought it was so beautiful. I was very invested in it. Gwen and Beth were each very vibrant, endearing characters, and I loved watching them slowly have the realization that they were attracted to each other and falling in love. It was really wholesome and lovely. The only reason this wasn't a 5-star read for me was that I didn't enjoy the third act miscommunication argument stage. I felt like it went a little too far in the rebound. There was some substance abuse and just some meanness during that portion. But overall, this book was really lovely and I was swept up in it. This is a very accepting historical fiction world where many, if not all of the characters are accepting of queer relationships, even though they have to be kept hidden from the wider society. Pretty much every character who learns about these relationships and the characters' sexualities are incredibly supportive. So it doesn't feel super realistic, but it is very wholesome and lovely to read. So highly recommend the first book. The second book I also enjoyed quite a bit. Again, we have the couple from the first book and other characters from the first book following us into the second book. So we get to see more of their journey and see how they connect with this next couple. The second book focuses on a gay couple, and I liked this one a lot as well. I think what I struggled with was that it was meant to be more of a enemies to lovers journey instead of a friends to lovers, but it felt a little too abrupt for me. These characters went from absolutely hating each other and being very, very mean and rude to each other to being not just sexually attracted to each other, because I think that would have made more sense to me, and maybe if the emotional attachment and romance had taken more time to arrive on the scene, it would have made more sense to me. But it was a very abrupt change from hating each other to being in love and being very romantic and sweet and caring. And there wasn't really any time spent on addressing the ways that they hurt each other and maybe trying to rebuild trust and atone for the awful things they both said to each other. Felt a little forced and unnatural for a while, but eventually I was on board and I liked them together. I found both of the main characters quite interesting, and I really liked seeing more of Gwen and Beth in this one as well. And a lot of the secondary characters were quite fun as well. So that was this little duology, very cute. I'm definitely interested in reading more from this author. Then I have 2 arcs from NetGalley, Bodies to Die For and Camp Lanier. Both of these are horror, but Bodies to Die For is adult horror and Camp Lanier was YA horror. Fortunately, neither of these really worked for me. Both of them were okay. They were fine. They just didn't really hook me. Bodies to Die For was a little bit chaotic and messy for my taste. It felt a little too campy and over the top in a cringy way. That's the best way I can describe it. I just felt it didn't make a lot of sense, and I wasn't invested at all in any of these characters' welfare, so I wasn't worried as things kept happening and people kept dying. And then for Camp Lanier, again, I thought it was fine. It definitely felt like it was written for a much younger audience than YA. It felt middle grade at most, which is fine. It just was not for me as a reader. There were some plot holes and some leaps of logic that I struggled with, and we had a bit of a cliche, cartoonish villain monologue from multiple characters at the end, which is never my favorite unless it's done in a very comedic, tongue-in-cheek way, and even then I sometimes don't like it. So this was definitely a case of me not being the audience for either of these books, but I also think both of these books had a couple issues that could have been resolved and things that could have been cleaned up a little bit with some more editing. Last book on this page is A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. This one is the second book, I believe, in the Ember in the Ashes series. I read the first book in my romantasy reading vlog, which I'll link down below for you, and really loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Even though it's YA romantasy, I just felt like it was a breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, the second book was not nearly as good as the first book. It was still good, but it wasn't great. I felt like all of the main characters lost what made them most intriguing and human in the first book, especially Laia and Elias. Helene held on a little bit more to her humanity, and I would say she was my favorite character in this installment, but she also felt like she lost, but it also felt like she lost a lot of what made her her in the first book. In some ways, it felt like I was reading a book about 3 completely different characters that just had the same names as the characters in the first book. Not nearly as much was happening plot-wise. It wasn't as engaging and exciting, and my favorite secondary character was only in it for a very short period of time, which just felt like an extra blow. So it was fine, but I found it more frustrating to read, especially because the romance between Laia and Elias became much more melodramatic in this book in a way that I found quite frustrating. I must admit, I rolled my eyes a lot while reading their interactions. It just didn't hit the same as the first book, which was very unfortunate because I loved book 1, but I did continue on in the series after this one. But you'll have to wait till my next reading journal wrap-up video to hear my thoughts on the rest of the series. Finally, I have the first 2 books I read for my Weird Books reading vlog. Again, that video will be linked in the description box so you can check it out. I'm not going to talk about these too much, again, because I have a whole reading vlog on these and the other 3 books I read for this video. But basically, very succinctly and quickly, participation was okay. There were things about it that I liked and things about it that I didn't like. I enjoyed how experimental it was, but I also found it in some ways to be too focused on being experimental at the expense of the story it was telling. 3 stars. The Weak Spot I absolutely adored. It is a very odd little book. It is very sparse, but it says so much with the few words that it does say. I loved it. 5 stars. Again, check out that reading vlog if you want so many more thoughts on both of these books. But to wrap up this video, I'm just going to flip back to the start of my reading journal and update my yearly spreads. So my index, just adding page numbers to all the spreads I made in this video and adding them to my index. Filling in my 2024 reading tracker. By the end of August, I'd reached 80 books of my goal of 125, so well on my way. Skipping my book bracket for now, since I filled that out at the end of the year. Checking in on my reading goals and my book bingo. This time I just have 1 more book to add to my Canadian authors goal. I didn't read any books from my 24 and 2024 list in the summer, and I also didn't read from any new countries to add to my reading around the world spread. So I'll do a little final flip through of the spreads I set up in this video and one final look at all the books I read in July and August. It was a really interesting couple months in reading, and I feel like I was having fun mood reading and jumping around from genre to genre. I am a little concerned about how few pages I have left. I'm really hoping I can fit all the books I read in 2024 in this single notebook, but it's gonna be touch and go. So wish me luck. This video is brought to you by my patrons, who I appreciate so much. Feel free to join us, especially in one of the top 2 tiers if you love to read. We not only have a monthly book club, which is the top tier on my Patreon, but the second highest tier is a quarterly buddy read. So if you want to read together, if you want to discuss books together, if you want to be part of a Discord full of lots of bookish people who have really interesting perspectives and are happy to talk books, then check us out. Consider joining our little community. And with that, I'm going to get going. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.